It was the late 15th century, and a Dominican friar named Heinrich Kramer found himself disgraced and frustrated in the city of Innsbruck. Kramer had arrived with a papal commission to hunt down witches, armed with a devout conviction and the authority of the church. But when he put a local woman, Helena Schauberin, on trial for witchcraft in 1485, things did not quite go as planned. The accused and her associates boldly defied him. At one point, Helena is said to have spat at Kramer in the street and cursed him as a bad monk, and the local bishop's court threw out most of the charges as baseless. Rather than securing the execution of witches, Kramer was rebuked and eventually even expelled from the city as an overzealous fanatic, not welcome. As you can imagine, this was a crushing blow to his ambitions. But out of this failure, Heinrich Kramer would pen a notorious treatise, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, published in 1487. This book became the era's definitive witch-hunting manual, a detailed how-to guide on why witches are real, how to identify them, and ultimately, what to do to them. Kramer's story and the creation of the Hammer of the Witches is a window into the world of the witch hunter, but it also invites a provocative question. How exactly does one become a witch hunter? It's not a normal career, that's for sure. And the idea of a witch hunter as a distinct profession is largely a product of late medieval and early modern Europe. In the popular imagination, fueled by lurid legends and a sprinkling of modern fiction, we picture grim inquisitors and roving witch-finders, torch in one hand, the Bible in the other, tracking down sorcerers in dark villages. But the reality, as usual, is quite a bit more complex. For much of the Middle Ages, the very concept of hunting witches was viewed with a bit of skepticism, and at some points outright disapproval by the church and state authorities. Yet by the end of the medieval era and into the Renaissance, Europe saw the rise of men and a few women who took on the role of persecutors of witchcraft. These individuals came from different walks of life. They might be learned theologians, zealous clergymen, lay magistrates, and even village leaders. But they shared one thing, and that was the unshakable belief that witches, people, mostly women in league with the devil, were a mortal threat to Christian society, and that it was their sacred duty to root them out. So today, we're going to talk about, well, how one would become a witch hunter, how exactly that path was, and we'll examine the evolution of witchcraft beliefs in Europe alongside it with the legal and religious changes that put all of this into perspective. I suppose it's a manual on the job, a kind of workplace training. First, let me welcome you to the channel. If it's your first time here, good to meet you. And if you've not subscribed yet, I invite you to hit that subscribe button. Now the other thing is too, you'll have no interruptions in this video. That's because we are sustained on this channel by our kind patrons, the YouTube members, those who check out the merch store, and also those who give the occasional donation on Super Thanks or the Patreon, the PayPal rather. All of those links are available in the pinned comment, video and channel description. And while you're there, give us a like and a comment and hit the hype button, always boost the algorithm, along with sharing on social media. Tell your friends about us. Now, with all that being said, you'll hear no more of it. On to the video. Of course, everything has to be put into its proper context, and you really must understand how witchcraft was viewed in medieval Europe. Now, starting early in the Middle Ages, that is, circa 5th to 10th centuries, The dominant attitude of the Christian church was actually one of skepticism toward the existence of witches at all, and this was long before they had this apparatus of persecution, of course, at least in the form of powerful, devil-worshipping sorcerers. Now, church doctrine around the year 900, encapsulated in texts like the Canon Episcopi, attributed to Regina of Prum, taught that many beliefs about night-flying witches or pagan goddesses were not real. They were just delusions. Yes, delusions caused by the devil, but still just delusions. They weren't actually witches. According to this canon, any woman who believed they flew by night with a pagan goddess was simply misled by the illusions of the devil, and those who taught such things were true, well, they were falling into heresy. In other words, the church at the time held a shoulder-shrugging view that witchcraft was just not a real, tangible power. It was just in that bag of superstitions and false beliefs inspired by the devil to lure people away from a good Christian life. And for centuries, this surprisingly rational view prevailed among the educated clergy. Occasional cases of alleged sorcery were punished, but typically as minor morality crimes or even cases of fraud, not as this existential threat. In fact, a church council as early as 785, the Council of Paderborn under Charlemagne, went so far as to threaten capital punishment for anyone who, blinded by the devil, harmed or killed a person accused of being a witch who magically eats human flesh. Such vigilantes were themselves to be put to death for committing murder based on pagan superstition. Though this decree, that's an interesting one, don't you think? So the people who'd go out and find the witches thinking they're doing God's work, well, they would find themselves at the pointy end of the law instead. And, well, it shows that in the early medieval period at least, that the authorities were more concerned with stopping witch hunts rather than encouraging them. Quite interesting, isn't it? But that didn't last forever. As the medieval era progressed, attitudes towards magic and heresy began to show a little bit of a shift. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the church faced serious challenges from heretical movements like the Waldensians, the Cathars, and of course a resurgence of occult practices. They were trying to pin them on the Knights Templar, that kind of thing. The formal institution of the Inquisition was established in the 13th century to combat these problems, mainly in the realms of heresy. And initially, this papal inquisition, staffed largely by Dominican friars, and Franciscan friars, it's a bit of a strange Freudian slip, isn't it? Was not particularly focused on witchcraft as we think of it. It wasn't exactly like that. It was more that the inquisitors targeted more doctrinal heresy. But of course, in the process, they sometimes encountered cases of sorcery or folk magic. Well, let's look at 1258. We have a case where Pope Alexander IV directed inquisitors to pursue sorcery only if it explicitly involved heretical deviation. For example, if Maleficium, harmful magic, was clearly tied to heretical rites or devil worship. Now, this indicates that mid-13th century church leaders still drew a distinction between simple folk magic and the diabolical witchcraft that would later become the witch hunter's job. Well, crucially, though, the door had been opened to considering witchcraft as a part of the Inquisitor's mandate, or at least in cases where heresy was suspected. And so, the late 13th and 14th centuries brought a few more ominous developments. A key turning point was the reign of Pope John the 22nd, that is 1316 to 1334, who became deeply concerned with reports of sorcery and black magic. John the 22nd himself feared that enemies were trying to kill him through magical means. A little bit of old-fashioned paranoia, making him respond by declaring witchcraft and magical conspiracy to be a form of heresy. In 1320, he authorized inquisitors in southern France to proceed against people accused of witchcraft, quote, by whatever means available, treating them as they would treat any other heretic group. Now, this papal intervention made it official church policy that practicing harmful magic in league with demonic forces was equivalent to heresy against the faith. And so, over the next few decades, several high-profile sorcery trials took place, often entangled with politics. For example, nobles and royal advisors in France were prosecuted for allegedly using magic to harm the king. The groundwork was being laid for the idea of the witch, not just as a village healer or a fringe-dwelling malcontent, but as a member of a broad satanic conspiracy that was threatening Christendom as a whole. And so by the early 15th century, parts of Europe experienced the first true witch panics in what is now Switzerland, in France, around the Alpine regions. A series of trials in the 1420s and 30s saw dozens of people executed for witchcraft, notably a Dominican theologian named Johannes Nieder, who wrote a book called Formicarius in 1437, which included the accounts of these early witch trials. Nieder described how uneducated women and some men were being accused of diabolical witchcraft, making pacts with the devil, gathering at secret nocturnal meetings and casting spells to blight crops or invoke demons. And this was a significant evolution in the stereotype of the witch, no longer just a solitary village crone casting the evil eye, but rather a member of an organized sect of devil worshippers. Nieder's writing still shows some ambivalence. He was skeptical, for instance, of claims that witches could literally fly through the air or literally transform into animals, but he affirmed that witches existed and could cause real harm with the devil's help. And he reported on actual trials too, for example in the region of Bern, where accused witches confessed under interrogation. These early accounts influenced later witch hunters greatly. So we might say that by the mid-15th century, the concept of the witch hunter was starting to take place as an individual. Authorities were beginning to treat witchcraft as a serious crime against the faith, worthy of investigation, and of course, worthy of punishment. But if there was one pivotal moment that created the space for this new profession to operate, it was the year 1484. That was the year that Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull, that is an official decree, titled Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, desiring with supreme ardor. This document essentially became the charter for witch hunting in Europe. In the bull, Innocent lamented that many persons of both sexes in certain regions of Germany have abandoned themselves to devils, incubi, and succubi, and by their sorceries cause ruin to crops, vineyards, fruits, and animals, as well as tormenting men and women, even preventing women from conceiving. Well, he explicitly acknowledged that these witches deny the Catholic faith and commit abominable offenses at the instigation of the enemy of mankind. Enemy of mankind, of course, being Satan, the devil. Well, most importantly, the Pope granted full authority to inquisitors, by name Heinrich Kramer and his colleague Jacob Sprenger, to prosecute this witchcraft without hindrance. A golden ticket, basically, license to kill. He warned that any local officials or clergy who obstructed these inquisitors in their work would face excommunication. In essence, the highest authority of the Church had proclaimed that witches were real, they are extremely dangerous, they are terrible heretics, and those who hunt them down have the full blessing of the Church to do whatever they want. Now, in hindsight, you can see how how this is all a little bit dangerous, but well, that's just the way it is, isn't it? Well, for an aspiring witch hunter in the late 15th century, Sumus Desiderantes, well, was an absolute game changer. Take the case of Heinrich Kramer himself. As noted earlier, Kramer was struggling to assert his authority in Innsbruck until the Pope's bull arrived, affirming his jurisdiction. Armed with this document, Kramer felt emboldened, even if in practice local powers still found ways to check his zeal. After his humbling Innsbruck experience, humbling, perhaps embarrassing, Kramer poured his energies into writing the Malleus Maleficarum. He included the full text of Innocent's bull at the start of the book, as if to say to every reader and every skeptical priest or magistrate that the witch hunt has official sanction from God's messenger on earth, i.e., the Pope. Now, the Malleus itself, when published in 1487, went on to become a kind of handbook for generations of witch hunters across Europe. That's both Catholic and Protestant. But it is important to realize that not everyone in the church embraced the witch craze. It wasn't like everyone was on board. People did think for themselves back then. I mean, not as much as we do now with our wealth of information and the legal rights to speak out about things, but yes, people did think for themselves. And even after 1484, some senior clergy and theologians were quite uneasy about the excesses of witch persecutions. Kramer's own order, the Dominicans, and the theological faculty at the University of Cologne reportedly condemned aspects of the Malleus Maleficarum, questioning its legality and Kramer's views on women. And in the centuries that followed, certain church bodies, notably the Spanish Inquisition, often showed more skepticism than fervor regarding witchcraft cases. The Spanish inquisitors, after a major series of trials in the Basque region, 1609 to 1614, concluded that most of the supposed witchcraft was more of a result of panic, delusion, and even false accusations and confessions. One famous inquisitor, Alonso de Salazar, wrote in 1614 that, quote, there were neither witches nor bewitched until they were talked about. Good point. Basically arguing that the witch hunts themselves were creating the very phenomenon they sought to destroy. And of course, if your attitude is, there's a devil behind every door, you're constantly looking for something, well, you're bound to find it eventually, even if you have to stretch the definitions. But such voices of doubt were the minority during the height of the witch-hunting era, and they weren't speaking too loud. No one wanted to be at the end of the executioner's rope or put up on that stake like everyone else. The general trajectory from the late medieval into the early modern period was an escalation of fear of witches and a greater willingness by both church and state to authorize hunters to pursue them. And so by around 1500, the stage was set. Laws were being passed that made witchcraft a capital crime in secular law courts. For instance, in 1542, England enacted its first Witchcraft Act, making witchcraft a felony. And the Holy Roman Empire's criminal code Carolina of 1532 explicitly prescribed death by fire for those who committed murder by magic. Well, both religious courts and state courts were now empowered and even expected to prosecute as many witches as possible. In short, the intellectual, legal, and theological foundations were now all there, and the new job openings were appearing. Witch hunter wanted in Innsbruck, witch hunter wanted in this town and that town. But who exactly would take the job? And how would they qualify themselves? What kind of person would become a witch hunter in medieval and early Renaissance times? Well, unlike some professions of the day, there was no guild or university course, no Cert 4 in witch finding. Instead, witch hunters emerged from various professions, primarily the clergy, but you had the judiciary and local government, and often their role as a witch hunter was an outgrowth of these primary roles. So we can identify several key factors that were commonly required for someone to take on the mantle. First was that deep conviction in the reality of witchcraft. First and foremost, an inspiring witch hunter had to truly believe in the danger that all of these witches posed. In an era of faith, it took a special kind of zeal to devote oneself to battling the unseen forces of evil. Many witch hunters were devout Christians, often clergymen, who had become convinced that the devil was actively recruiting humans, especially witches, to undermine Christendom. Well, for example, Heinrich Kramer was clearly driven by an almost obsessive conviction that witchcraft was not only real but rampant, epidemic proportions. Even when others doubted him, he would still hold to these beliefs. And in fact, as you say about those people who, when they hold very strong beliefs and are presented evidence to the otherwise of them, instead of accepting that evidence and taking a step back, they rather cling even stronger to those beliefs. You could probably assume the same with Kramer. But similarly, Jean Bodin, a French jurist who never personally tried witches but wrote an influential witch-hunting manual in 1580, argued fiercely that anyone who denied the reality of witches was not only a complete idiot and heretical, but effectively in league with Satan, holding hands, skipping down the road with him effectively. Now, a witch hunter's conviction might come from personal experiences, rumors, local tragedies, blamed on sorcery, maybe even a childhood encounter with a charm of a wise woman, or perhaps, too, from education, reading demonology treatises and theological arguments. In any case, absolute certainty in the witch craze was a baseline requirement. This conviction was often tied to religious zeal, and many hunters saw themselves as doing God's work by confronting the devil's agents. And they could cite scripture, such as Exodus 22:18, even though that is Old Testament. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Well, when you got stuff like that coming straight from the Bible, that's about as good of a justification as the witch hunter can get. Well, faith alone didn't make a witch hunter. You couldn't just rock up. One also required some form of authority or sanction to conduct witch trials. Those who became witch hunters typically already held positions that gave them legal or moral jurisdiction. For clerical witch hunters, this meant being an inquisitor or a priest with the backing of a bishop or even the Pope. Heinrich Kramer, for instance, was officially an inquisitor appointed by the Pope himself, and without that he couldn't have roamed around just trying random people for heresy. Other famous cases include Nicholas Remy, or Remigius, in Lorraine in the late 16th century. He was a secular magistrate, a judge, who took it upon himself to prosecute witches in the region, ultimately claiming to have sentenced over 800 witches to death. Well, in England, where there was no Inquisition, witch hunting was often carried out by local justices of the peace once witchcraft was criminalized by the statute. However, there is one peculiar English example. Matthew Hopkins, styling himself as the Witchfinder General in 1640s, without even having a formal higher office. He would just show up to various towns in eastern England, and they would hire him to uncover witches during a time of civil war and breakdown in normal authority. But Hopkins is a bit of an outlier. Even so, he still had at least tacit approval from some local magistrates for what he was doing. Generally, to be a witch hunter, you needed either an official commission from the church or state, or at least the informal support of sponsors, local lords, councils, clergy, who would allow and assist the process of investigation. But without such backing, an individual going around from place to place pointing the finger at people for witchcraft could easily be dismissed as a troublemaker, a weird outsider. They could even be punished themselves, as we saw in earlier periods. But of course, successful witch hunters often possessed a certain education or expertise, though not always a formal one. Many were learned in theology and law, because prosecuting a witch was, well, it was quite complicated in legal terms, and also involved in elaborate theological notions like demonic pacts, signs of a witch, and proper conduct of interrogations. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum provided something of a curriculum for the would-be hunters. They taught how to recognize a witch's deeds, injuries, and maladies with no natural explanation, how to overcome a witch's supposed powers in the courtroom. For example, we have a section where Kramer advises that the accused should be prevented from using magic in court by shaving all of their hair and perhaps chaining them up, because it was thought witches could not speak spells if they were constrained. A little bit of pseudoscience from that. Of course, there is also the sections on how to question witnesses and suspects, which was quite methodical. Many witch hunters were avid readers of growing demonological literature. In the late 16th century, one could read Malleus, as well as works by authors like Martin del Rio, a Jesuit who wrote another treatise called Descriptiones Magicae, or Francesco Maria Guazzo, who wrote Compendium Maleficarum, which compiled anecdotes of witchcraft and advice on procedure. Even secular magistrates often had those books on hand, just as a bit of a reference. On the other side, some witch hunters gained knowledge through hands-on experience with prior trials, a grisly form of on-the-job training. They might start as assistants to senior judges, or as junior clergy, observing an inquisitor, gradually learning the techniques and perhaps adding their own refinements. But one should note that this knowledge was a mix of fact, fear, and folklore. For instance, a witch hunter might be knowledgeable about how to identify a devil's mark, that is a supposed insensitive spot on a witch's body, or how witches supposedly could not say the Lord's Prayer without stumbling. Well, these were not true in reality, but they were part of an accepted expertise of the craft. In short, becoming a witch hunter meant immersing oneself in the era's lore about witchcraft, which we might call a specialized education in demonology and trial procedure. Many witch hunters were driven by strong personal motivations too, which could range from genuine religious zeal to more worldly ambitions. It would be a little bit too cynical, I think, to say that all witch hunters were just complete opportunists. Clearly, some like Kramer or the Puritan ministers in New England were acting out of sincere, if tragically misguided, belief. Yet history also shows that ambition and the prospect of reward played a role, and that's where we get to that outlier, Matthew Hopkins. He's quite instructive. He was that English witch-finder general that we mentioned, a young man of Puritan background, who found in witch hunting a chance to rise from obscurity. For 2 years, between 1644 and 46, he and his small team traveled from town to town, conducting investigations, and they charged fees for their services. Records indicate Hopkins demanded around 20 shillings per town, and some communities paid hefty sums. One town paid him £23, which was a large sum at the time, to get rid of all the witches. By the end of his brief career, Hopkins may have earned the equivalent of a noble's annual income and was responsible for 300 executions, or murders, whatever you want to call them. Similarly, In earlier continental witch trials, local magistrates and even neighbors of the accused could benefit from the confiscation of a convicted witch's property, since convicted goods were often seized by the authorities, and this created a dark incentive for some to pursue witch cases. None of this is to say that wealth was the primary motive for most witch hunters, but it certainly was there for a few of them. And hey, it's, making a little bit of money on the side. Well, everyone wants to do that, regardless of any veneer of piety. But then there was reputation and power. They were also at stake. Successfully unmasking a nest of witches could bolster a magistrate's standing as a stalwart guardian of the community, or a cleric's reputation as a pious warrior against Satan. Witch hunting could thus be a career booster. Until, and unless, the political winds changed, or an accused witch turned out to have powerful friends, which, well, that sometimes happens. You should probably do your research before pointing the fingers. So really becoming a witch hunter required a confluence of belief, authority, knowledge, and drive rather than any, official certification. The would-be hunter had to believe in the threat, have the means to pursue it, know how to conduct a hunt, and want to carry it through despite the moral and social hurdles it involved. It's important to note, too, that few people only hunted witches. Usually, witch hunting was an episodic activity in a broader career. For example, a judge might handle witch trials among many other duties, or an inquisitor might investigate witches in addition to other heresies. Nonetheless, a number of individuals in history became so infamous for their focus on witches that the witch hunter has become their defining title in the annals of history. But once someone stepped into the role of witch hunter, how exactly did they go about the work? The process of identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting a witch drew on a mix of traditional legal procedure and a few horrifying innovations. Witch hunters, whether operating under ecclesiastical courts or secular courts, tended to employ a core set of tools and methods. The first tool was textual. The manuals, the books that outlined the theory and practice of witch prosecution. Chief among them was the Malleus Maleficarum. Its hefty tome provided a step-by-step guidance. Part 1 of the Malleus educated the reader on the theology of witchcraft, insisting that witches are real and that denying their existence is heretical. Part 2 catalogued the alleged activities of witches in lurid detail, from demonic pacts and sexual intercourse with devils, to the brewing of potions from infants' flesh, and the casting of spells that blight harvests or steal men's virility. But this section served to alert a hunter to what signs or confessions to look for. Part 3 then laid out the legal procedures for a witch trial, how to conduct an arrest, how to safeguard against a witch's possible enchantments, and how to question witnesses. Ultimately, how to get the confessions. The Malleus unabashedly endorsed the use of torture. Questioning under torture was sanctioned as a necessary means to secure the truth from those in league with Satan, as they wouldn't give it up easily. And it counseled that normal safeguards could be relaxed. For example, it allowed testimony from dubious witnesses against witches, on the premise of witchcraft being an exceptional crime. Other manuals, too, complemented the Malleus. King James VI of Scotland wrote Demonology in 1597, which, though more of a dialogue than a how-to, reinforced many similar ideas, and even discussed texts like the swimming of a witch, so he just dunked them in and out of the water. Well, the effect of these texts was to create a widely shared playbook for witch hunters across different regions. A judge in Germany in 1600 and a county magistrate in England in 1640 might both be aware, for instance, that witches often have the devil's mark on their body, or that a witch may be unable to recite the Lord's Prayer without stuttering and stumbling over themselves. Thus the manual spread a kind of homogenized methodology. You can imagine with that Lord's Prayer thing too. Well, when you're under a bit of pressure, stuttering is going to be, it's one of those things you might not be able to avoid. Now, witch hunters typically did not act until some sort of accusation, or perhaps a strange event brought a suspected witch to attention. And there were common triggers, misfortunes like sudden illnesses, livestock dying, or storms destroying crops. The community would look for someone to blame, often a marginalized or contentious person. The witch hunter's first job was to evaluate these reports. Often it started with rumors or complaints. For instance, in small villages, a conflict between neighbors could spiral into an accusation. My cow died after some woman looked at me, so she must be a witch, that kind of thing. Well, once an accusation surfaced, the authorities might detain the accused for examination. In some large witch panics, hunters used the testimony of one accused witch to implicate many others. This was especially the case in continental hunts, where under torture, suspects were asked to name accomplices. Witch hunters became adept at spotting signs of witchcraft, and explained witches' marks like the strange moles or scars on the body, jars of herbs or ointments in a suspect's home, dolls with pins in them, thought to be used in curses. I mean, I don't know why they'd have dolls with pins in them anyway in the house, but well, each to their own. Or even the presence of a pet cat or toad, feared as a witch's familiar spirit. It's tragic to note that many of these signs were entirely circumstantial or innocent, but in the eyes of terrified communities they became damning evidence. And like I said, if you look hard enough with a little bit of stretching, you're going to be able to find evidence anywhere. But the centerpiece of the witch hunter's method was the interrogation of the accused. In ordinary medieval or early modern justice, torture was sometimes used. But with witches, it became especially routine and brutal. The logic was that witches, having pledged themselves to the devil, would not confess their sins easily. Thus, extraordinary pain was justified to break their silence. Torture instruments ranged from the strappado, hoisting a person by the arms tied behind their back and then dropping them, which could dislocate the shoulders. Not good. And then he had thumb screws, leg vices, and of course, the rack. Everyone knows about the rack. Well, some inquisitors also employed psychological torments like sleep deprivation. Matthew Hopkins, for example, favored keeping suspects awake and walking for days, utterly exhausted. The poor individuals would babble and often implicate themselves. And it must be emphasized on an academic level that evidence extracted by torture is unreliable. We know this now in hindsight. Many accused witches confessed to things that were impossible, like flying on broomsticks and shape-shifting into animals, consorting sexually with the devil, etc., just to end the agony, or because they were led on by the interrogator's suggestions. However, at the time, a confession, even a fantastical one, was treated as the best evidence. According to church law, a witch could only be executed if she confessed. Since witchcraft was a spiritual crime, her own admission of guilt was needed to hand down the ultimate penalty. But secular courts were slightly less strict, but in practice they too sought confessions to secure convictions. Thus, the witch hunter's mission was often centered on getting this confession by any means necessary, and torture was, of course, the grim mean to that end. But beyond formal torture, there was a few other little tricks that witch hunters resorted to, bordering on superstition themselves. One notorious practice was the swimming test. It was essentially a trial by water. The suspect's hands and feet would be bound, and they were lowered into a body of water, sometimes tied to a rope. The idea, endorsed in King James demonology, is used by Hopkins, among others, that water, being pure, would reject a witch, causing her to float, whereas an innocent person would sink, and hopefully be pulled out before drowning, but, It was a no-win scenario. Floating led to execution as a witch. Sinking meant death by drowning, though considered posthumously innocent. Another method was pricking for the devil's mark. Hunters believed that a witch had a secret mark or an insensitive spot on the skin where her imp or familiar sucked blood. They employed professional witch prickers who used needles or special bodkins to poke the accused all over, which was obviously an unpleasant ordeal, but if they found a spot that produced no pain or blood, then that was taken as proof of witchcraft. Unfortunately, some prickers cheated by using retractable needles that would only give the illusion of no blood. Essentially, fraud to secure a conviction. There were also observational tests. For example, it was noted whether the accused could weep. The persistent belief was that witches hardened by the devil could not shed tears. If a woman did not cry under interrogation or in court, perhaps because she was in shock or just had no tears left to cry, this too was added to the pile of evidence against them. If a trial proceeded, a witch hunter, as a prosecutor or judge, would marshal witnesses. Often the villagers who had fallen ill or lost cattle, or sometimes other confessed witches testifying against the accused. Normal rules for evidence were of course loosened. Hearsay was allowed, and often the accused had no lawyer or anyone to speak in their defense beyond a token advocate appointed by the court, who usually did very little to protest. He didn't want to be thrown into the witch category himself. Once a confession was obtained, there was very little doubt of the verdict. The typical sentence for convicted witches was death, most often by burning at the stake on the continent. In England and New England it was a bit different. Usually they would hang them. Burnings could be public spectacles, meant as both punishment and a stern warning to others. In some cases, authorities showed a grim mercy by strangling the convicted witch before the flames could consume the body. And the witch hunter's triumph was seen in the elimination of the witch and the presumed restoration of divine favor to that afflicted community. It is estimated by modern historians that between the 15th and mid-18th centuries, the European witch trials resulted in tens of thousands of executions. Each of those represents a human life caught in the machinery of fear, guided in part by the methods that we have described. But it should be noted that not all witch hunters were equally cruel or credulous. Some followed procedures more scrupulously and avoided the more extreme methods. Others, however, like Pierre de Lancre in France, who conducted a brutal witch hunt in 1609 in the Basque country, or the prince bishops of Germany who oversaw mass burnings in the 1620s, rather displayed a terrifying single-mindedness in pursuing witches with executions numbering in the hundreds. The methods employed were a reflection of the era's legal system, interwoven in with its worst nightmares. Now, witch hunting touched nearly every corner of Western Europe, but that doesn't mean that it didn't manifest differently from region to region. In the German-speaking lands of the Holy Roman Empire, the trials were often especially fierce. Decentralized authority meant that the zealous local ruler or judge could initiate massive witch purges. For example, in the early 1600s, Prince Bishop Johann von Dornheim of Bamberg, nicknamed the Witch Bishop, set up a special torture chamber and oversaw hundreds of burnings in a few years. And the magistrate Nicholas Remy in Lorraine claimed to have condemned over 800 witches to death. These men became witch hunters by virtue of their office and fervor, turning legal power into a tool of terror. Up in England and Scotland, the pattern was somewhat different. England's more centralized legal system and traditional common law safeguards meant fewer large-scale panics, but witchcraft was still prosecuted, especially after the monarchy, such as James I, formerly James VI of Scotland, encouraged a very hard line. Scottish courts, with the Kirk's encouragement, held numerous witch trials, and Scotland's execution rate was actually higher per capita than England's. There were famous Scottish cases, like the North Berwick trials of 1590–91, where several people, including a healer named Agnes Sampson, were accused of raising storms to imperil King James's ship. In England, hunts tended to be more localized affairs, driven by village accusations, with authorities stepping in to try suspects by jury. Yet the chaos of the Civil War period allowed figures like Matthew Hopkins to operate as pretty much free agents. Hopkins' activities from 1645 to 46 show that even in a country without an inquisition, a determined individual with a modest legal backing could spearhead a deadly witch crusade. France saw its own variability. Some regions experienced intense witch persecutions, while others were more restrained. In the Basque territories of southwestern France, a 1609 hunt led by Judge Pierre de Lanque executed perhaps a dozen alleged witches, based on fantastic claims of Sabbaths and devil worship. Well, by contrast, the Parliament of Paris, the highest court in France, grew skeptical of witch trials by the late 1620s and increasingly overturned convictions from rural courts. This high-level skepticism in France helped curtail the excesses of local witch-finders as the 17th century progressed. Meanwhile, the Iberian and Italian lands under Roman and Spanish inquisitions had surprisingly fewer witch executions. The Spanish Inquisition, after investigating a major outbreak of witch hysteria in 1610, the Basque witch trials, that is, concluded that many of the accused had been caught up in a collective delusion. Inquisitors like Alonso de Salazar Frias argued against further burnings and effectively put a stop to large-scale witch hunts in Spain. In Italy, too, the Papal Inquisition was cautious. Cases of witchcraft often resulted in mild penances, unless linked to other heresies. Thus, in southern Europe, the role of the witch hunter was more often subsumed into the broader duties of an inquisitor, and overt witch purges were quite rarer in the north. Across Western Europe, then, one could find the witch hunter in many guises: the village-level enthusiast, the roaming commissioned expert, the learned demonologist judge, or even the church inquisitor. Regional culture and legal structures really shaped how far such people could go. But everywhere they shared a common mindset that we have discussed. Whether in a German principality or an English shire, the witch hunter saw himself as enforcing the law of God and nature against an occult rebellion. By the late 17th century, this figure was disappearing across all regions as skepticism took hold and laws finally changed. But even at the height of the craze, witch hunters faced critics and skeptics who actually had the courage to question the trials. A few brave intellectuals argued that it had all gone too far. For example, the Dutch physician Johann Weyer in 1563 argued that many accused witches were actually just mentally ill or simply deluded, and he denounced the cruelty of the persecutions. Likewise, the English gentleman Reginald Scott wrote a tome in 1584, flatly denying that witches had any real power, and attributing reports of witchcraft to imagination or trickery. These dissenting voices were largely ignored, or sometimes condemned by authorities of the time. James of England even ordered Scott's book to be burned. He didn't like it. But still, They planted the early seeds of skepticism, trailblazers you could call them. Over the 17th century, such skepticism began to spread. The Enlightenment mindset, emerging in Europe, emphasized reason and, of course, empirical evidence, and that made educated people increasingly doubt these fantastical claims that had been accepted in witch trials. Legal standards gradually improved as well. Judges and magistrates started requiring more concrete proof of maleficium, and grew less willing to accept confessions obtained under torture or the testimony of supposed possessed accusers. High-profile miscarriages of justice also made authorities more cautious. The notorious Salem witch trials of 1692 in colonial New England, though outside Europe, served as a pretty grim example. A court initially accepted dubious spectral evidence, and multiple innocents were hanged. But eventually, the hysteria was recognized, and the remaining accused were released. Incidents like this, widely reported, showed everyone the dangers of unchecked witch hunting, certainly a PR nightmare. By the early 18th century, the climate in Western Europe had fundamentally changed. Witchcraft ceased to be viewed as a plausible crime by most lawmakers. One by one, countries repealed or reformed their witchcraft laws. For instance, England abolished the old witchcraft statutes of 1736, replacing them with laws against fraud, implicitly recognizing that claims of magical crime were false. The final executions for witchcraft in France, Germany, and elsewhere took place around the late 17th or very early 18th century. Witch hunting as an enterprise was effectively over, and the very idea of the professional witch hunter became a subject of maybe horror, maybe ridicule, but certainly not of admiration. In enlightened circles, to go on a witch hunt was now a metaphor for an irrational persecution, not some kind of holy spiritual crusade. And thus within a few generations the role of the witch hunter passed into history. It has arisen from fear, sanctioned by faith and authority, and ended when reason and skepticism finally caught up with the people. The decline of witch hunting was not sudden, nor was it simple, but it happened piecemeal, people slowly learning from the tragedies of the past. It all comes too late for the victims. In any case, by the mid-1700s, a young person could no longer realistically become a witch hunter. The age of Kramer, Hopkins, and their ilk had come to a close, and a new age, more skeptical and secular, had dawned, but certainly not an end to the persecutions, not an end to the tragedies, just more blood to come. Well, who knows if that will ever be over. It's certainly strange to step into the shoes of such people. And we began with the question, how does one become a witch hunter? But I think the more appropriate question is, why does one become a witch hunter? Is it through faith? Is it through greed? Or is it just pure, kind of religious, psychotic zeal? In any case, the witch hunter was a product of a specific mindset, a worldview that saw human affairs as a battleground between God and the devil, and the witches were just the foot soldiers of darkness. Stepping into that role required an unwavering conviction in that worldview, no doubt allowed, no gray areas, but it also required institutional empowerment. The laws and leaders had to give you license, and by and large, those who became witch hunters were already authority figures who took the prevailing anxieties of their communities unto themselves and offered an answer. I will find the evil. that is causing all of this horror in our lives. Let me get rid of it for you. Here's the bill. Well, thank you very much for listening. Been a pleasure. I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters, funding the channel so I don't have to go out and hunt witches for money. F. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron. Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfanir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review. And go check out Orthodox Review's channel. It's really good, actually. Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Towery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Catty B, Lovely, Boma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivelio, and Chris. All right then. Well, that's enough for me today on witch hunters. But you're not considering a career change. Well, thank you very much for joining me once again. It's been a pleasure, as it always is. And I would like to wish you all the best. Lots of love to you all out there, and farewell for now.